First, an overview of the history. Long before neurodiversity in the 1940s, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger first described autism. And they did this in terms of case studies, which are like science stories, descriptions of people that they study, which is basically one form of narrative. And of course, each of them, Kanner and Asperger, got to shape their own narratives, put their own spin on it. But the perspective of autistic people, the subjects being studied, was completely absent from these narratives. To make matters worse, parents of autistic children were demonized early on. Psychoanalysts blamed cold and distant refrigerator mothers for their children's autism, which is a narrative that endured for decades and caused a lot of damage. Children being taken from their families, institutionalized, forgotten about, traumatized parents, etc. So, as a reaction, parents started autism organizations to support each other, understandably. But the voice of autistic people themselves was still rarely or never heard in these organizations. The first parent-run organization was the National Autistic Society in the UK in 1962, the NAS. So where is the autistic narrative then? It took the internet for autistic people to finally be heard. Before the internet, autistic people were almost all isolated from each other. Not only did we live far from each other, we were also kept isolated from each other by parents and professionals who wanted to make us normal. The early internet began to overcome that. The internet was all text back then, no video. So it also eliminated autistic difficulties with body language and other problems with face-to-face communication. There was no social media then. Starting any group was difficult and required the support of a large organization. In 1992, parents of autistic children started the first online autism forum, the St. John's University Autism mailing list, because all discussion was via email back then. Parents validated each other's experiences and viewpoints on that forum, supporting each other in trying to make their autistic children as normal as possible. But then something interesting happened. One after another, autistic people started showing up in this community. This did not go very well. The parents mostly used autistic participants as resources, and they considered communication between autistics to be an annoying waste of bandwidth. Autistic members quickly started questioning and opposing the parents' ideas of an ideal treatment outcome. They basically said, "We don't want to be normal like you. Autism is a way of being that can be beautiful. We just want help with the problems and barriers we face. Here is how we would have liked to be helped." But most parents were dismissive. They thought that these internet people who claimed to be autistic were nothing like their children. Now, parents of autistic children, previously blamed for their children's autism, were already traumatized and entrenched and on the defensive. At the same time, autistic people also had a lifelong traumatic experience. The experience of being treated as less than human, etc. So we had perfect conditions for igniting a conflict that continues to this day, especially in the English-speaking world. So eventually, autistic people on that list were fed up with being patronized. And one of them, Jim Sinclair, with some others, then started the first autistic-run organization called Autism Network International. As of 1994, it ran its own university-supported discussion mailing list, ANIL, the ANI list. This was the first online autistic space. Like in other communities in the disability rights movement, the people with the disability in question, autism, are in charge. But for autism, this was new and radical. The community also invited what they called cousins, people with autism-like conditions or autistic-like experiences. Autism Network International's inclusive term, Autistics and Cousins, ACs, kind of foreshadowed the neurodiversity paradigm. And in 1996, Autism Network International organized AutRead, the first conference for and by autistic people. And AutRead took the idea of autistic space to real life, to the three-dimensional realm, as it were, and changed many lives for the better. But ANI wasn't quite everyone's cup of tea. It soon developed its own little subculture where many of them fit in very well and others not so well. So the need was felt for an alternative. As it happened in 1996, I entered the scene. I was newly diagnosed autistic at the age of 22, after spending my childhood and early adulthood being different, but having no idea why. By that time, I already had a decade of experience as a computer programmer, and that experience allowed me to set up my own list server on my own computer, run over dial-up. So between 1996 and 2012-ish, I ran a set of discussion mailing lists called Independent Living on the Autistic Spectrum, or INLV for short. And I originally did that to help someone who was excluded from other groups, but it quickly became my community as well and defined the rest of my life. And some of my group's members came up with ideas that proved influential. For instance, the Australian sociologist Judy Singer and the American journalist Harvey Bloom jointly popularized the term neurodiversity based on ideas that were discussed on my group by autistic and other neurodivergent participants. So around 1998, developments on the internet finally made it easier for almost anyone to start their own group. My group had been running for about 2 years by then, but around 98, public commercial list servers started showing up where anyone could start their own discussion list quite easily. And then websites with forums appeared, and some of these forums became very big, like wrongplanet.net, founded in 2004. And finally, social media turned everything on its head, but I'll spare you that rant. The neurodiversity paradigm also started spreading to other neurominorities. They also started taking note of it and started applying it to their own communities. For instance, it is now also very much used by communities of people with ADHD, hyperactivity, or Tourette syndrome, or dyslexia, and even the stuttering community, which I thought was very interesting. And there were a few significant things in the English-speaking world that really galvanized the movement. In 2007 and 2009, a couple of very nasty campaigns received global attention. One of them was the so-called ransom notes campaign, which was run in 2007 by the New York University Child Study Center. And in 2009, a parent-run organization called Autism Speaks ran an advertisement called I Am Autism. Both of these portrayed autism and other neurodivergent conditions as monsters that kidnap normal children and hold them ransom. And this was really an attempt to further prey on parental desperation. And it caused the neurodiversity movement to be further galvanized, along with an unending series of scandals of mistreatment in institutions. One example of such mistreatment, probably the most infamous example, is the routine use of remote-controlled electric shock devices at the Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts. Something that the United Nations has actually condemned as torture, yet continues to this day. And the neurodiversity movement is still fighting things like that. So this concludes a very brief overview of how the neurodiversity movement came about. It's all because autistic people met on the internet. To read more about its history, I highly recommend Stephen Kapp's open access book I showed at the beginning and will show again at the end. And it has chapters on all the points I could only touch on very briefly here, and many more. Now we continue to discussing the present state of the movement and some of the things that have come up. First, here's a brief overview of the basic tenets of the neurodiversity paradigm. Basically, what is neurodiversity? First of all, neurodiversity is an aspect of biodiversity. Brains vary, as does everything else that is biological. And this variation can be beneficial and is in fact essential to the survival of species. So, neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Neurological difference is not necessarily pathological. Just because it's different does not mean it's bad. However, that does not mean that all neurological difference is good. Some neurological conditions are not even compatible with life. However, with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., some abilities are enhanced as a result of the very same characteristics that can also be disabling. In other words, the good and the bad are often inseparable. Taking myself as an example, the same autistic feature that makes it difficult for me to engage in neurotypical social chit-chat also enhances my ability to be honest and truthful. The same autistic feature that makes me get mentally stuck a lot, unable to start an activity or stop one that I've already started, also makes it possible to dive more deeply into an area of interest than almost anyone else. So, if embraced, autistic features are a real source of potential. But this does not deny the reality of disability. The social model of disability, which Fabrizio already touched on briefly, states that disability results not only from impairments inherent to the person, but also from society's failure to adapt for those impairments. So the notion of disability includes both those who feel primarily disabled by inherent impairments and those who feel primarily disabled by society's failure to include them because they are different. Either way, though, rights and power inequalities are also important in this. Autistic people and neurodivergent people in general are a minority in society that frequently suffers from being systematically disadvantaged and discriminated against. So the neurodiversity movement falls squarely within the disability rights movement. In summary, the neurodiversity paradigm is the radical notion that humans who are different are human and entitled to the same human rights as everyone else. And for autistic people in particular, this was a controversial notion for many decades. Now, when people talk about neurodiversity, we include all neurological conditions in that, but there's also neurodiversity within the one condition that we call autism. In other words, maybe autism is not really one single condition. Maybe it's not really one single thing. Autism may be multiple conditions with multiple causes. In 2016, there was a study called ASD validity, Autism Spectrum Disorder Validity, that concluded this. They said the ASD diagnosis lacks biological and construct validity. And by saying this, they were not saying that it doesn't exist. They were saying that the definition as currently used is wrong. What should be done about it is not yet clear. What we should not do, however, is divide up our community with arbitrary distinctions. We should not just make up some differences and divide people in groups based on those, because that mistake has already been made before, with the false distinction between autism and Asperger's syndrome. That distinction only existed for historical reasons and was not actually valid. We should not repeat a mistake like that. At the same time, even though the subcategories of autism are not yet known, we should remain open to the possibility that they exist. We should remember that what is true for one autistic person may not be true for another. For instance, for most of us, autism very much feels like part of who we are, and we would not want to change who we are to fix our problems. But there are also autistic people for whom autism feels like something they have, not something they are. For whom autism is something separate from who they are. However, most autistic people do seem to have something important and fundamental in common. There is some evidence that autistic people often process things in similar ways, despite all our differences in communication and cognitive abilities. And there is something fundamentally similar about the way we communicate as well. For instance, we autistic people tend to be more direct, and we tend to say what we mean and mean what we say, unlike neurotypicals. The timing of our communication is also different. We tend to be less fast-paced and need more time for processing. So, there's a clear need for the autism label, at least for the time being. And in any case, it will continue to exist as long as people continue to identify with it. So there is something like an autistic culture or subculture based on our shared communication characteristics. You could compare it with deaf culture, where this is much more clear. The shared communication between deaf people is sign language. Our autistic communication commonalities are more subtle than that, but just as real. It is easier for autistic people to communicate with each other than with non-autistic people. But does this include all autistic people? Are we including everyone who needs to be included communication-wise? I don't think we are. We're still not managing to reach most non-speaking autistic people or those who have cognitive disabilities. We somehow need to do better at reaching them and including them. Another thing is that the neurodiversity movement does not include people who want to be cured, who don't like their autism. Right from the beginning in 1992, the autism rights movement rejected these people, and the neurodiversity movement still does. I think that's wrong. Yes, we should totally advocate for everything we've been already advocating for, autism acceptance, pride, rights, etc. But that should not come at the cost of rejecting people who have a different experience of autism. They too would benefit from having rights. And no one is more in need of acceptance than those who cannot accept themselves. The neurodiversity movement is also mostly isolated from other disability rights movements. In part, this is because other disability rights movements are mainly centered around physical disabilities. For instance, deafness, blindness, or physical disabilities that require you to use a wheelchair. Neurological disabilities are still considered to be more in the realm of psychiatry and not so much disability. So, and on the other hand, the neurodiversity movement itself has not been very good at reaching out to other disability rights movements either. So that is something that I hope will improve in future. I believe that all disability rights movements have certain common interests and could do with working on understanding each other better and learning how to cooperate in fighting for the rights of the people with the respective disabilities. Another inclusion problem I see in the neurodiversity movement is that it's mostly English speaking. It is sort of spreading outside the English speaking world, but the English speaking world is very much leading it, is defining the terms in which we're talking about it. And some of this does not translate all that easily to other languages or other cultures. The new European umbrella organization, UCAP, is trying to do something about that by putting national autistic-run organizations in many European countries in touch with each other and trying to create an international community that consists of more countries than just English-speaking ones. Another problem I see in the neurodiversity movement as it currently is that it is quite white, as in not many people of color are reached or included. I don't really know how to solve that, except we could perhaps do with reaching out more actively. But I've also seen some autistic people of color complain that within the neurodiversity movement, they were subjected to as much racist prejudice as anywhere else, which is a bit disappointing, really. So we should try to be better about that. And finally, the neurodiversity movement is quite activist, which is good. It's necessary. However, activism can also lead to conformism, because we're all trying to fight for a common goal. But it can lead to rejection of those with a different point of view. And I've been a bit disappointed that the neurodiversity movement has not been all that open to diversity within its own movement. So I think we need to be better about that. So, which is not to say that it's all bad. The neurodiversity movement does mostly try quite hard to do the right thing, but there are certain things that could do with improving, and maybe some of us need to take a step back and rethink some things. One thing that's been very important in the neurodiversity movement is identity. Because we're all identifying as what we are these days. Now, my viewpoint on that is a little different, because I lived without an autistic identity for about 2 decades before I was diagnosed, right? So I was autistic without knowing it. I was autistic without identifying as autistic. Yet, I was still autistic. And I did not fit into the neurotypical society. And I very, very strongly felt the effects of that, the effects of being different without knowing why. So then I found out about autism, and I recognized myself in it. And this label autism became my key to belonging somewhere. And eventually, through running my group and participating in it, the fact of being autistic became embedded in my sense of identity. Yet, even now, I still wouldn't say that I identify as autistic, as many people do these days, especially in the English-speaking world. People always identify as this or that. But I remember too well the experience of being autistic without having an autistic identity. And that is still very real, and it is still really autism. Now, based on this identity has emerged the idea of identity politics. Identity politics is that people should have certain rights based on what we identify as. But how about those who won't identify or cannot? Should I not have had rights before I identified as autistic? And another thing is that neurodiversity is based on biological essentialism. In other words, we are different because our brains are different. Does that not make identity irrelevant to the question of rights? Isn't it neurological differences we're talking about? And shouldn't our rights be derived from our needs instead? Neurodivergent people need certain things to be accepted and need other things to be accommodated for in order to function well in mainstream society. And we should have a right to that acceptance and that accommodation. But I believe identity politics here is a big distraction, because these neurological differences is something that we have whether we identify with them or not. Now, disability. Neurodivergent conditions such as autism are usually considered disabilities. In some countries, especially in non-English speaking ones, this is a little bit controversial because of the idea that not all difference is bad. But if you consider the social model of disability, then not all disability is bad either, because the social model says that people are not inherently disabled, but are disabled by society's failure to adapt for their differences. Whereas the medical model says that people are disabled by their, things that are wrong with them, by their impairment or by their medical problems. Now, both of these models have validity. Both of them are useful in certain ways, but all models have limited validity. So there's a risk of over-application, right? In 1976, there was a statistician named George Box who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think it's very useful to remember that. I think the social model of disability is probably the most useful model that has come out of the disability rights movement ever. However, that does not mean that that model is equivalent to the whole truth of people's experience. The social model is usually taken to an extreme, but the medical model has been taken to an extreme for much longer than that, especially in autism. Because in autism, since the 1940s, basically everything that is different, everything that is autistic has been considered wrong and to be fixed. Now, an interesting question is it possible to be autistic without being disabled? Officially, according to diagnostic criteria, it is not, because the differences have to be what they call clinically significant. But in practice, according to the social model, how disabled you are depends on how well you are accommodated for, how well people accept your differences, how good the help you get is. So in that sense, it should be quite possible to be autistic without being disabled, to be just different. Unfortunately, that is not how diagnostic practice works. So autistic people run into the problem that if they grow up in an environment where they are very well understood, where, they basically don't develop social problems because they have other neurodivergent children to play with, where they, can practice social skills with other people who are also different. Those autistic people grow up very different from those who never fit in and have a different presentation of autism. They're still just as different neurologically, but they find it harder to get diagnosed. Yet they might still need a diagnosis in order to, for instance, get a job in mainstream society. So that is a problem. And eventually diagnostic practice is going to have to adapt for that. So, disability, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And we should, accept our position in the disability rights movement. Now, most of you probably have heard of Autscape. I already showed the logo in an earlier slide. It's a 3-day autistic run event in the UK that both Hetta and I are involved in as well. In fact, Hetta had a hand in actually starting it. And Autscape is a good example of neurodiversity in practice. Not so much the activist form of neurodiversity, but the practical form of it, how to actually implement the principles. Autscape is designed for autistic needs, and autistic people are in charge of running the event. But we welcome everyone, regardless of identity or diagnosis or self-diagnosis. We do not ask who is autistic and who is not. And this way, in practice, the vast majority of the audience is autistic, but we also include those who are questioning, who are not sure whether they're autistic or not. Because actually going to Autscape and spending 3 days immersed in autistic community is quite a good way of finding out whether you jive with this community or not. And whether you have a similar communication style as other autistic people. It can give you a good idea of whether you too might be autistic. And then there are also some people who are otherwise neurodivergent, who are not autistic, but still different, and who find themselves fitting in to Autscape and finding community there. And we are happy to include those people as well. In addition, we have no special rules for carers or allies. Our friends are included equally, and it is safe to be yourself. But when autistic people are themselves with each other, you find not only recognition, but also disagreement and different viewpoints. At Autscape, those disagreements are usually quite respectful, but unlike in activist spaces, it's not the space where you should expect everyone to agree with you. Now, I think we're running out of time. So quite quickly about the neurodiversity movement's achievements so far, because we have achieved something. We have achieved greatly increased awareness in society about autism and other neurodivergent conditions. We have achieved a widening of the diagnostic criteria so that many more people are now diagnosed autistic as were before. Many more people are now recognized. We have achieved participatory autism research, which means that now many more autistic people participate in autism research than before. We've achieved campaigns against institutionalization and maltreatment, although there's no great progress there yet, unfortunately. And we've achieved small islands of accessibility, particular organizations that specialize in employing, for instance, in employing autistic people or other neurodivergent people. So, conclusions. We in the neurodiversity movement need to include a greater diversity of disability and functioning levels and viewpoints on autism. We need to be better about including racial and ethnic minorities. We need to cultivate healthy boundaries and productive ways to deal with disagreement. We need more empathy with parents and carers, even neurotypical ones. And there are some unifying goals. There are some goals that pretty much everyone should have in common, no matter how much we disagree with each other, even with parents and carers, which, you know, full representation and participation of autistic people in all things to do with autism, support and accessibility, and human rights. I believe those are things we can all agree on, and those are good things for the movement to concentrate on. Now, for further reading, I highly recommend this book, Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, edited by Stephen Kapp. It's got 19 chapters by 21 authors about the forming of the autistic community and the neurodiversity movement. I've got a chapter in there myself as well about the group that I ran. It was published in 2020. Hardcover and paperback are available, but you can also read it online for free. I will paste the link in the chat in a little bit once I stop sharing screen. Thank you, everyone.